No matter where you find yourself on the political spectrum, you probably feel as though the United States is under immediate threat and crisis today in 2025. If you're a big fan of President Donald Trump, you probably see this as Trump's endeavors to drain the swamp, to put America first, to rebuild the society that has been stolen from us over the last many decades, and to bring America into a new golden age as he has proposed. If you are not a fan of Donald Trump, you probably see this as a threat to the fundamentals and foundations of democracy itself, that we're staring down the barrel of corporatism and plutocracy and autocrats and oligarchy and fascism. And if you fall on either end of that spectrum, I think you have the same general sense of dread and crisis state. Now, that would make sense if you couch this in the book that was written in the 1990s called The Fourth Turning by William Strauss and Neil Howe. And they, in many people's eyes, have successfully predicted the future. And I'm going to unpack that here for you now. If you enjoy this video, please hit the like and subscribe button and share it with your social media friends. I do have some notes here, so I will periodically be looking down. Hopefully that's not too aggravating for you. But right now we would find ourselves in what's considered a fourth turning, whereby the United States as a country is in a crisis. That crisis period lasts for about 20 to 25 years, and we come out of that crisis, not necessarily for the better, although it could be, but we come out of the crisis in some way having reshaped and reformed the society in which we live in. And so that's where we find ourselves at the moment. Now, let me take you through sort of the sub-phases of the fourth turning. And once we go through that, you can see if that sort of makes sense to you in terms of what today feels like. And then we'll unpack the other three turnings so that you can understand, once we find ourselves on the other side of this crisis, what might be coming. So the authors don't actually break down these categories within the fourth turning, but as a general note, I think that a lot of people have sort of coalesced around some subcategories here, so I thought I would share them. The idea is that there is a catalyst. There's some trigger, a significant event or a set of events that sparks the crisis era. In our current situation, that's broadly considered to be the 2008 financial crisis. So 20 to 25 years from 2008 is when we would be looking for this crisis to resolve itself. So we are maybe 3 to 8 years away. After the catalyst, you have regeneracy. So you have society begins to unify around a response to the crisis. So here's where you see sort of factions breaking off, right? You have some people who think that we need to bail out the banks and shore up the financial institutions and carry on that way. There's other people who are tired of bailing out big institutions. This too big to fail concept is really unpalatable. And the sense of the difference between the wealthy class and the businesses that are too big to fail and the individual is stark and feels bleak. And you had things that were cropping up like Tea Party, and obviously at this point we have MAGA, and basically some fracturing within the country on how to best move forward through the crisis to try to solve it. This brings you to the climax. So the climax of the crisis is obviously the peak. This is the most intense and transformative moment. This is what could happen. Major wars, revolutions, or restructuring of power typically happen here. So we find ourselves at this very moment in some sort of tariff war, if it's going that direction. I don't know if we would consider it tariff war yet, but let's just pin that for the moment. Revolutions, if there is a general sense of some revolutionary spirit in the U.S., that doesn't have to take the shape of like 1776, right? There's many ways. There's cultural revolutions that we saw in the 60s, for example, and there's many different ways in which this could take shape. Restructurings of power. This seems like an obvious one, especially with Trump coming into power and this time around seemingly wanting to ensure that he is not bringing in a lot of legacy folks, the ones that would sort of be deemed by him and his followers as deep state. And then Doge obviously coming in, Elon Musk just absolutely doing what he can to, if we want to put it euphemistically, restructure the power. The outcome of this climax subphase is what determines how society will emerge into the news cycle. So on the other end of that, you have obviously widespread protests at the moment, and you have maybe something coalescing there that's still not yet fully formed, that would offer something different than what you're seeing from Trump. Maybe something around what you're seeing with Bernie Sanders and AOC, maybe something, totally sort of out of left field, like Andrew Yang has been talking about, forming additional parties, and that sort of thing. And maybe some wild card is still out there, that will be thrown into the mix. I've floated things like Jon Stewart coming out and doing something different than just hosting a show, for example. So my sense is we are probably in the climax moment right now, which is why it feels so intense. And I do think there's probably some surprises still to be seen until we get to the fourth subphase, which is the resolution. This is when the crisis concludes, a new societal order and values are established. This will make more sense when I talk about the historical context here. Right? When we look back and say, okay, these are previous fourth turnings, you'll understand what that looks like. But you come out of the crisis and there's some new societal structure. Now just keep in mind, like I said, this doesn't mean that it's a societal structure for the better. It's not as though there's a caterpillar and cocoon, chrysalis, and butterfly moment here. It's not necessarily always this coming out beautifully and transformed in a magnificent way. Things could fall apart and get very dark here. But that's then when you enter into the next 80 to 100 year phase and you roll with the new society that has been created in the previous fourth turning. So that's the sense. That's where we are right now. So let's back up. If that feels true to you, then let's sort of visit things at a little bit deeper level. So again, there's four main turnings. The first turning is called the high. The second turning is called the awakening. The third, the unraveling, and the fourth is the crisis. So let's give examples and unpack what the whole thing looks like. So just keep in mind, each of these four turnings lasts about 20 to 25 years, right? That gives you the full 80 to 100 year span for the full seculum, as they call it, which is just the full breadth of the full four turnings. So the first turning is called the high. So when we come out of this crisis, theoretically, we should be in what's known as the high. The mood is optimistic, it's unified, and it's institutionally strong. So again, just keep in mind, these could be institutions for the better or worse. This could be unification for better or worse. Optimism, there are folks who will be optimistic for dire means, for not great reasons, right? You can be optimistic and enthusiastic for things that generally would be seen as not great things. But that's the mood. Society is rebuilding after the crisis. Institutions are once again trusted, but just keep in mind, these institutions, they could be malformed institutions, right? These could be ill-meaning things, but they will be trusted and they will be fortified. Individualism, here's what's important. This will feel very different from the last, say, 30 years or 40 years. Individualism is downplayed. So this is a reduction in individualism and a strengthening of institutions and sort of community. The youth role, they are protected and generally a bit on the conformist side of things. Here's an example from history, the post-World War II America. So the late 40s, to the 1960s, obviously the crisis that they were coming out of there was World War II. Right? And think of what led them into World War II. So their whole crisis period here, that 20-ish year span, was like late 20s to late 40s. And so you had the Great Depression wrapped up in there. And you had then all of the efforts of FDR, right? That was what was happening in the middle of the crisis. That was FDR forming all of these new, the new way forward. I mean, it was called the New Deal, right? So he was reforming institutions and society in that way. And this is why leadership matters in the midst of a crisis, because oftentimes it's the leaders will prevail. Not always, but sometimes that can be the case. And so, leadership doesn't just have to be who's in the seat of the presidency or who's in control of Congress. It could also be leaderships who are opposing them, right? And so that leadership could, of course, win out as well. But it is important to identify who the leaders are in the crisis moment, because they will likely largely shape what it is that is going to be bolstered and buoyed as you get into the high. So coming out of that, and then World War II, and then the crisis, that was the resolution to the crisis, right? The ending of World War II, and then you're into that period of the late 1940s into the early 1960s. So that's what the high looks like. So that's what we have to look forward to coming out of this. The second turning is called the awakening. So the next 20 to 25 years is the awakening. The mood here is spiritual unrest, questioning authority, and seeking personal meaning. So in that first turning, you're having strengthening of institutions, right? Coalescing around a common goal and a real sense of sort of working together. And with that, you get rid of the individualism, right? The individual is really, really subdued. And then you get a little bit of a pushback, right? You get a little bit of individualism coming back into the fray. And with that, you get some questioning of authority. It'll feel quite mild to the questioning of authority that we've seen throughout the 90s and the early 2000s and present day, of course. But this is where those little seedlings kind of start. Folks start to, once again, sort of seek personal meaning. They start to get some distance from the last crisis. And so that doesn't feel as dominant to them. And so this is where they start to look for that growth individually. Institutions start to be challenged, and the focus shifts to individual and spiritual expression as you work your way through the second turning, considered the awakening. The youth role in this period are the rebels, the idealists. And this example is the consciousness revolution, the 1960s to the 80s, right? I don't think I have to drone on about what, we can still see from the 1960s in the United States. Many revolutions, right? There was the drug revolution, the spiritual revolution, the sex revolution, many, many things, right? There was still a lot of effort trying to fight against racism and unfair practices in that space. And so that's where the challenges and the pushing started to come, and that resolved or passed through by about the early 80s, which kicked off the third turning called the unraveling. And if you were born, I was born in the early 80s, we've been living through the unraveling and the crisis so far in our lives. And if we can hold on long enough, we would at least get to experience the high and the awakening. So the unraveling, if you think about the 80s to the early 2000s, it's cynical, it's fragmented, it is increasingly highly individualistic. Society starts to see its institutions get weakened. Individualism strengthens, right? So there's always this push and pull. When the individualism goes up, the institutions get weakened. When the institutions get strengthened, the individualism gets weakened. Culture wars start to deepen. So this is where the setting, by way of culture wars, starts to take shape for the coming crisis. Right? The culture wars will sort of evolve in a way into the crisis, or will at least help inform what the playing field for the crisis will be. The youth in this period is pragmatic and alienated. So you think of Gen Xers. I guess it would be younger Gen Xers and older millennials, and then like wrapping up with most of the millennials. So younger Gen Xers and the millennials considered to be pragmatic and alienated. I suppose so. And so the example here is just 80s to 2000s. If you were going through it, I probably don't need to belabor it too much. The one thing that sort of stood out to me was thinking about weakening of trust in institutions. We saw 9/11 happen, right? And there was this sort of brief-ish moment of coming together, and then it really unraveled. And then there was all this questioning around who really did this to us, and are we being led into now invading countries that actually had largely nothing to do with it? And then are we sinking ourselves into decades-long war, and how are we getting tricked into this, right? There was a lot of trickery afoot. Condoleezza Rice and Colin Powell, and things that they were purporting to be true that later came out that just were not true, but were reasons that were thrown out there to be able to sort of get some public perception and push to be accepting of an invasion and a war. So it's that sort of like erosion that can persist even through something that could be seen as like a codifying event. People coming together for something like 9/11, but it's just easily washed away and eroded back into the swamp, if you want to think of it in those terms. And then we get the fourth turning, right? So that persists through the 90s, or 80s, 90s, and into the early 2000s. So this was maybe a bit of a lengthier one. This is maybe more in the order of 25-year span, right? And then the fourth turning is what we're in now. The mood, if I need to inform you of what your mood probably is, urgent, decisive, high stakes. I think everyone feels that. Again, no matter where you are finding yourself in the political spectrum, I think you probably feel that the stakes at this moment are intensely high, the highest that you have ever felt that they've been in your life. Society at this moment, the institutions are torn down and rebuilt. Again, predicting the future. This book was written in the 90s. The social order is fundamentally restructured. That's what I think we are in the midst of at this very moment. This is what I think we will start to see what this restructuring, this fundamental restructuring actually is and what it looks like over the next 5, I guess at the bare minimum we have 3 years left, so 3 to 8 years here. And the youth role, so the youth in this period are heroes in the making. And so these are archetypes that they put to people, children who are born in a crisis period are considered heroes. They have these archetypes of what the children who are born into a particular turning are. And the ones born in a crisis period are considered heroes in the making. Example is the current period. So I don't think that I need to get too deep into that. We talked about the 2008 global financial crisis. This is why it fits being a catalyst. Institutional failure, right? Major U.S. financial institutions collapsed, had to be bailed out. Public trust completely broke down. The confidence in Wall Street, if you remember Occupy Wall Street, that was a thing. The American dream took a massive hit. There was the subprime mortgage scheme that totally blew up in people's face, where people all of a sudden were owing much more money on their house than it was worth. They had taken out loans and gotten mortgages that they had no business getting. They had no way that they were possibly going to pay it. And they then bundled these things up, and I don't want to get too deep into the finances of it all, but it was a scheme. There's no other way to put it. It was a scheme, and there was no way. I don't know how they ever thought that scheme wasn't going to blow up. and maybe they did and they just didn't care. And it is that sort of cynical thought that is indicative of an unraveling that leads you right into a crisis. Economic and social fallout, so the Great Recession sparked long-term political polarization. So the Great Recession is what is called the 2008 financial crisis. Generational resentment, meaning a lot of folks in my generation, X and millennials, feel fairly resentful of boomers, for example, right? That they are hoarding power and wealth, and keeping sort of a death grip on institutions that should be passed down to subsequent generations to let them influence it in a way that feels meaningful and correct, proper to them, and the world that they want to see for the future. Populist movements on both the left and the right take shape. Again, I think I had mentioned at the very beginning, like Tea Party sort of things. I think WikiLeaks happens like somewhere along the way here. Edward Snowden comes along eventually, right? You have all this stuff with the NSA spying on people. You have the Patriot Act. That would have been a bit before this, but that would have been part of the unraveling that was leading to this. But you see just sort of this dominoes of things. Like I talked about the lies and whatnot that got folks into the Iraq War. And yeah, it's a complete unraveling is a great way to put it. And then you come out of that unraveling and you have all this stuff that has just been constantly unfurled. And then you get dropped a Great Recession on top of it. So the ripple effects of this is that it wasn't a one-off event. Its consequences are still shaping society. Obviously, you can see how it's easy for me to connect the dots, right? Having gone through it, and obviously I get a little worked up talking about it because it's frustrating. Student debt burdens to housing instability to political discontent. I mean, if that doesn't perfectly describe today, I don't know what does. People talking about, we talk about student debt a lot, and that is a thing. It's an issue. Credit card debt is immense and is crazy. Housing instability. You hear all these young people talking about, I have no idea how I will ever afford a house. Now, I will say I thought that for the first 40 years of my life as well. So it all of a sudden was possible. So I don't know if that's normal or, it's hard to know if what you went through is normal, if things are truly different at the moment. And obviously political discontent seems obvious. Some notable mentions, if we want to think of it that way, of possible candidates for what the catalyst was that put us in our current crisis. 2001, so we talked about this a little bit, but that, again, definitely feels too early. I think 2008 financial crisis makes much, much more sense. And then the other one that feels much, much too late is COVID. But COVID, if you think of that, no matter what you think of it, hoax, overblown, legitimate, it went a long way to just grabbing people by the shoulders and thrusting them in a direction that they were already sort of leaning into, right? If they were already leaning into distrust and mistrust, or if they were already leading into, we need to start to restructure ourselves around institutions and trust and society. Whichever way you're leaning there, and I know I'm taking two, and that doesn't cover the spectrum, of course, but I think that COVID, for a lot of people, grabbed them by the shoulders and just tossed them completely in the direction that they were already leaning in. And maybe some people, it about faced them and shoved them off in the direction that they weren't going. But that definitely stands out to me as a bonus catalyst, if you will. Where do we go from here? I have the question here. What might resolve the current fourth turning, right? So this is the obvious question. So, okay, we're in the midst of this right now. The idea, if this theory holds up, is that there's a high at the end of it. Everyone wants to get to the high in the awakening, right? I mean, you'll be staring down the barrel of 40 to 50 years after we get through this crisis of a high and an awakening. Yay! But what does that look like, right? Like I said, coming out of the crisis doesn't mean that you are chrysalis to butterfly all of a sudden. You could come out looking just awful, and society could be really depleted and degraded and in a treacherous spot. So here's some, I don't know, crystal ball, hypotheticals, theories, proposals, whatever. So general characteristics of fourth turning resolutions, right? How do we get out of the crisis that we're in and into the high? Decisive collective victory over a major crisis. So again, I think there is still a bit of a question of what is the major crisis that is going to befall us, I would suppose any month now, that will take the next 3 to 8 years to resolve. What is it? Is it a war? And that could be a trade war. Like I said, it doesn't have to be a hot war or a cold war, some other form of cold war, right? Some type of collapse, institutional collapse, financial collapse, whatever it is. Some sort of revolution, a cultural revolution. Again, I don't know. I'm not saying hot revolution. I don't know. But these are just sort of common themes. If you look back, if you think about going back sort of 80 to 100 year blocks of time, right? So we talked about World War II. Well, what was 80 to 100 years prior to World War II? It was the Civil War. What was 80 to 100 years prior to the Civil War? It was the Revolutionary War, right? And so the last 3 crises have been war. Obviously, I hope that that's not the case. I have no desire for us to end up in any type of war. But I don't know that you can just elect your desired crisis. Or in fact, I know that you can't elect your desired crisis. But I don't even know what my desired crisis would be. But I mean, certainly a hot war of any shape or form, I mean, it sounds just awful. So I don't know. But I just want to say this isn't me throwing this out there for some really sadistic reason. It's because the last crises that resolved were World War II, a Civil War, and Revolutionary War. So just putting that out there. Characteristics, again, so coming out of that, rebirth of civic institutions and shared national purpose. I mean, doesn't this sound wonderful? After the decades of fevered pitch, building around, everyone gets fractured off into their own little groups, into their own little individuals, coming together, community, national purpose, a general sense of shared experience and driving towards something meaningful for the overall betterment of the nation. There's clear winners and losers coming out of this, and again, you hope that the winners are the good guys, but I think there is a healthy swath of the country at the moment who is still wondering who the good guys are, and that's diminishing, I think, quite rapidly. But I think that they're still out there. So, and a new social contract. So, what does that look like? Again, we talked about the New Deal, and that was, set in motion during the crisis period. Obviously, crisis period of the Civil War, right? Here's where you had Emancipation Proclamation. Here's where you had the Gettysburg Address. You had these things. You had clearly Lincoln saying, we have to preserve the Republic. The Union must stay together. And obviously the Revolutionary War reshaped a whole bunch of different things, right? from Constitutional Congress to, Federalist Papers to Constitution. I mean, wild times coming out of that, and the reshaping of society at that moment, obviously some of which took shape during the crisis, but then really sort of blossomed and bloomed in the high after. But I do think my understanding or my sense of what the fourth turning into the new first turning looks like, the seeds are planted, right? Again, you think New Deal stuff. The seeds are planted and what the new society is going to look like. And then those things really sort of sprout, they get watered and tended to, and they're allowed to bloom and grow in the new first turning. So that's the big question right now. What seeds are being planted, and what are we sort of setting ourselves up for a restructured society to look like? Possible resolution paths being considered. So again, we're in crystal ball territory, but why not? A major political restructuring or realignment, constitutional crisis, collapse of trust in existing parties, major reform movement, right? So additional parties, abandoning of the existing parties, constitutional crisis that maybe requires some amendments or a reforming of the Constitution. At some points, I think I've said before in different videos on this channel, if we are so intent on not following the Constitution, we should just do the brave thing and just say, we're going to write a new one. I know that there's not stomach for that. I'm not saying that's what should be done, but I'm saying if we're going to ignore the one we have, we should at least just write a new one. Major reform movement, I mean, that could take a lot of different shapes, right? And would it be all-encompassing, right, across the board, or would it just be in the financial sector? Would it just be economic? Would it just be political? That's the question, major reform. It may result in a new political consensus or system, Second American Republic sort of vibe. So that's one option. Another option, a large-scale war, again, or a near war, right? Again, I talked about Cold War type of deals. Some worry about potential global conflict, right, with China, some sort of multipolar world war. If a war happens, victorious, united America could emerge stronger if the nation pulls together rather than fractures. So again, what would that look like? I really don't want to think about it, so I'm going to move along. A technological or economic reset, AI, energy revolution, nuclear fusion, renewables, or a new economic model, right? Something that's post-capitalist, or leveraging the decentralized systems, right? This DeFi and things that are sort of have come along with. Oh, sorry about that. That is the opening bell to the stock market. Something, crypto, blockchain-y, right? That this DeFi that we're always told is so important. Even then, like economic reset, like does Bitcoin come in and actually become this flourishing thing, this like new standard that we're told that it could possibly be? We'll see. Could it resolve deep economic inequality? Right? Reinvigorate national productivity and unity, right? Make people feel like they can afford homes again. Well, I wouldn't even worry about afford homes again. Make people feel like the American dream is back again, that there is dignity and want to be a part of the middle class of America, that this greed mentality of like, you're either a billionaire or multimillionaire or you're nothing. And just the siphoning off of the middle class and the undignified nature that I think that has somehow become what the middle class is at the moment. But to me, the American dream was always that you could do what you're supposed to do in society. You don't have to be excessive, right? But you do your standard job and you do it to the best of your ability, and you can have a house and a car. You could put food on the table. You could have a family. You would have time to spend with your family. That to me was always the American dream. Now I'm sure it's different for different people, but some sort of reemergence of the American dream out of this would be, I think, a tremendous, tremendous win. Number 4 on my crystal ball here, a cultural or spiritual awakening or unifying moment. Some people believe that we'll see a renewed sense of purpose, morality, or national identity, maybe. Could be religion-based, civics-based, or even sort of planet-centric. It seems unlikely at the moment, but who knows? And I would say it's probably more likely to come from grassroots or generational influences rather than from existing oligarchs, elites, however you want to think of it. Wrapping up here, some sort of takeaways that I grabbed from experts. Millennials will likely lead the rebuild. They are the hero archetype. So if you're a millennial, you were born if you were born into the crisis era, you are the hero archetype, like the GI generation that built post-World War II America. The boomer generation, their archetype is prophets, may serve as moral guides or as a fading generation that hands over power amid institutional collapse. Right? That might just be the case. Of course, here the outcome's not guaranteed. A successful fourth turning resolution requires unity, courage, and sacrifice. But I heard somebody talking about this a few days ago, and they were saying how wonderful it is that we're going to come out of this in a new first turning, in the hope phase. And I just thought that wasn't my takeaway at all. So I wanted to come in here and put out sort of a counterpoint. Sorry, not a hope phase, the high phase. And just say we can come out of this in a really, really bad place and have to work ourselves through 4 more turnings at least, just to get ourselves back to a new high. And so that the society that we set in motion right now is what will dominate, most likely, if this theory persists, for the next 80 to 100 years. And so we have 3 to 8 years or so to settle that. And so I wish you luck in the coming climax and resolution of the crisis, and we will see what happens.